Here it goes.
Okay, it's February 17th, 2021, and this is another session of the 2021 Ontology Summit. This is Track B, Harmonizing Definitions and Improving Ontologies. I'm Gary Berg-Cross, a member of the Ontolog board, and I'm going to be presenting together with my partners who are bold on the first slide, Pier Buttigieg and Kai Bloomberg. But there are other contributors who may be online, but certainly were part of what we presented on this topic at the Earth Science Information Partners meeting last month. It was called Advances in Semantic Harmonization for the Cryosphere to the Earth Sciences. Okay, here's my session outline. I'm going to give a brief recap of what I presented 2 weeks ago as part of the launch. And then I'm going to spend a little bit more time defining definitions or defining harmonizing of definitions. We will then move into the environmental ontology and scope and topics and so forth. I'll be handing off to Pier. Then he will cover, among other things, examples from this harmonization work. We have a brief presentation from Kai Bloomberg on tools that help us do some of this harmonization. And we'll close out with some issues and next steps by Pier before we get into our planned discussion. So before I start presenting on definitions, I just wanted a brief introduction to our speakers who will become later on. So Pier Buttigieg has a wonderful title, Digital Knowledge Steward and Senior Data Scientist. He's researching new digital ecosystems for the Earth and environment, which things like suite ontology are relevant for that, but he's also worked as part of environmental ontology. He's at the Helmholtz Metadata Collaborative Platform, where he works with them. He's worked as a number of years as a data scientist at the Alfred Wegener Institute. He has a PhD in bioinformatics, as well as a master's in marine microbiology. He lists his main research interests, and there really are many that could be added to this, as microbial ecology, bioinformatics, ecoinformatics, and ontology development, particularly the environmental ontology, but also active with other ontologies like SWEET. Our second speaker will be Kai Bloomberg, who works for the Biological and Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office, which is BICO-DEMO. He's a PhD student at the University of Arizona and their Biosystems Department, where he integrates and provides analytical tools. You'll hear a little bit about one of the tools he's helped us with and do some of the harmonization. And he's also an important contributor to the environmental ontology and has been an ESIP fellow. Okay, so in terms of covering a little bit about the material from the launch, this slide really does quite a bit of it. And this actually is from our presentation at ESIP. It's one of Pier's slides that was presented by Ruth Doerr. So what you see here is part of what's called sometimes the semantic spectrum or the ladder. And you see at the bottom things that supposedly have weaker semantics like vocabularies, moving up to things that have a bit more semantics, such as RDF. So we get into machine readable things like ontologies. But the point of the harmonization effort that we're engaged in is that you have to harmonize at all these levels, so that vocabularies come in many different forms and they mean many different things. So it's really quite an effort at the bottom to actually harmonize things so that the glossaries make sense in a harmonized fashion. As you move up, you have to harmonize each of these elements. And I make the point that our topic last year, knowledge graphs, had to harmonize all of these things together because knowledge graphs draw on potentially all of these resources and others. Okay. So here's a little bit of a diagram on definitions. It's basically a two-part diagram. On the left, we have the term, such as ablation. It's defined by the thing on the right. And we say things like, what type of thing is ablation? It's a process of a certain type. So very simply, in terms of definitions, we try to make distinctions. We try to convey terms or understanding about terms to reduce ambiguity, the intended meaning of things within some context. On the left side, maybe we're talking about humans. We're reducing ambiguity for the purposes of communications, but also now we are reducing ambiguity by axioms in a logical language so that these terms and their meaning can be used as part of applications. Oops. All right, so here we are. So whenever we're going to work on a harmonization of terms, there have to be some guiding principles, some requirements for the work. So this is a little bit of a summary of some principles that are pretty obvious. As part of reducing ambiguity, we show relations and we show the structure of things. You run into, for glossaries and things of that nature, you run into synonyms where things may be equivalent or they just may be similar, and you have to make distinctions. There actually is an entire spectrum of similarity that you may have to make distinctions on. And of course, to do that, we do use things like subtyping, part-whole relations, role relations, and things of that nature. Also, when you're dealing with definitions, terms rather, some of them are compounded. They have lexical modifiers like alpine glossary. Of course, in the biomedical realm, has been a very big part where some spatial relations and some qualification of a concept is based on the modifier. ISO rules were mentioned last week, and there are some, but to a person doing knowledge engineering, they're pretty basic, except for the one, be brief. I have trouble with that. I tend to be more encyclopedic in my natural tendencies, but you'll see maybe when you look in ENVO the advantages of being brief and the types of definitions that can be axiomized there. Okay, so this is a slide from one of our co-workers, Mark Schildauer. I'm not sure if he's on yet or can make it, part of the briefing, where it's essentially a selling point. Say, why go through all this difficulty of harmonizing things and drawing things out and making sure that these are synonyms or they're not synonyms, they're related, and so forth? Well, you run into difficulties if you don't do that. Existing vocabularies are often hard to find. What's the quality vocabulary that you can use? That's an issue itself. Sometimes you just find terms, errors in spelling, of course, and things that are missing. And of course, there's much overlap and redundancy. So that's one problem we know about. The other problem we know about is if you don't do some of this upfront, adjusting things later on, particularly if you're formalizing these things in ontologies, gets to be a problem. And here, this lists some of the possible problems, including the fact that you didn't take granularity. What level are you working at? And you're equating things that are really at very different levels. Okay, so let's see if I can move on from that. So here is a little bit of material that you may hear more about from Celia later on, who we'll be getting in a couple of weeks on definitions, equality, formal definitions. There's a reference here, guideline for writing definitions and ontologies, which is a good source on this. I've taken a few of the ideas here, added one of my own to it. So as they say in this guideline, definitions will vary according to context of use and target audiences. That is to say, things like you may have a term that's used different by a geographer than a geomorphologist. If you think of the hydro realm, there are many different takes on that, both as science and also just by regular people. So you have to take that into account. What is the context that you use? What is the goal here? And of course, then you have to adapt the text to some formal, that is the definition, to some formal structure, such as by subtyping, by part whole and roles, and so forth. The article, the guideline also makes use of an important point of adjusting what you have there for the person who is going to be consuming it, the agents, essentially what they know and their competence. So can they essentially make use of that definition? Does it make sense to them? I added the last one down here, which definitions and supporting axioms have to be competent so that an ontology can answer competency questions. In knowledge engineering, we often think about ontologies in terms of that. Okay. So here's now finally an example of term harmonization, actually from our last week's work. It's not complete, but it illustrates some of the issues. We were looking at Ruth Doerr's work on to harmonize a concept like snow cover. And the first thing to do was to gather all the sources and say, okay, here they are. How do we resolve this? Are these one thing or are they multiple things? So for snow cover, She had, among other things, 3 different views of snow cover. One is the first one on slide is the extent of the cover. Another one looks at it in terms of layers, and another one looks at it in terms of depth. You notice we have an arrow going over to what's the Global Cryosphere Watch, GCW, in terms of her proposed solution to this. And this is a simple definition, which uses some different terms, such as adheres in snow, because looking forward, this is the way some ontologies describe the relationships. So that part of the harmonization may take into account how this thing is modeled in an ontology that has proven to be useful. Below here, we see part of a spreadsheet. Now, Brute created massive spreadsheets of many terms. This spreadsheet has terms for rain and freezing rain and hail with her definition, GCW definition. And on the right, some of the background materials, as you see above, the 3 different ones. Now, this spreadsheet actually is a evolved spreadsheet that Kai will talk about briefly later on. It's what's called a robot template, so that we not only had something that was processable by humans as a spreadsheet. If we populate this particular template in this particular way, it can be imported into an ontology like ENVO. It is an OWL, so it helps us be more efficient. And Kai will tell you more about that later. Okay, just a few more slides for me before I turn it over to Pier. I wanted to show a little bit about what some of these concepts look like inside ENVO. So here we have a portion of land, the concept land, a portion of the hierarchy, showing it's a material entity. It's part of an astronomical body part in this view. It's also a geographical feature. And of course, inside an ontology, we have the definition here, and we have comments about it. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the many relations that are populated in Protégé version of the ontology. So we have all the subclass relationships. We note that an island is primarily composed of land, as an example, and that it's used in agricultural processes. It's partially surrounds a lake and so forth. So many things about land are expressed within the ontology. Here's another view, a little bit more of a Protégé itself view of the elements in here. I just wanted to show you some of the features that are able to be captured within Protégé. So we know, of course, about the hierarchy. In this case, we're looking at a different concept, Cryosphere, within a glacial feature. That is, it's under that. We also note that there are lots of links, so that each element in here has a link, unique link, so it's identified. We also identify the person who has been responsible for entering this material with an ORCID number. We know there's not only the definition, but there are places for synonyms, associated notes, and some of these get very encyclopedic. But that is one way of being brief, is to have the definitions being brief and then include sort of background material that might be of use for these type of things. Okay, well, with that, here, if this is okay, let me turn it over to you to discuss ENVO. And just tell me when you want me to advance the slides.
Sure. So thanks, Gary, for putting these slides together. As I noted, I just came out of a series of meetings, so I didn't get a chance to review them. So audience, please forgive any divergences that are there. So yeah, ENVO came about. Initially, it started as a project within the Genomic Standards Consortium, and it started as a pretty lightweight controlled vocabulary of not too many in terms, but the terms that were needed to describe the origin of samples that would be sequenced for genomics, etc. That's where it started, and a group of us were working on that in the early days, and it started to expand into ever greater environmental ranges as more genomic samples started coming in from stranger and stranger places, the mouths of hyenas, you name it. So then very quickly we realized that we needed a bit more technology to support the expansion of this thing, because we were getting multiple inheritance hierarchies, and the organization of simple hierarchies wasn't possible anymore. So that's when we acquired new skills, new capacities, new collaborations, and then advanced ENVO up to something we could express in OWL using the OBO Foundry's formalizations. And it's grown since then. It's now used quite widely across multiple initiatives, multiple UN data system initiatives, as well as a bridge to ESIP, so NASA, NOAA, USGS, and others. And it's, again, a community resource. We're trying to get more and more editors on this to open it up and do pull requests while trying to maintain as much rigor as possible. And that's where the sort of challenge comes in, because we have to accommodate both the real-world application arenas and the people deploying this sort of thing on the ground. It has to be somehow usable and intelligible to them, while simultaneously trying to keep some degree of rigor and also revisiting the older parts of ENVO that were developed when it was semantically looser and trying to refine them with things like pattern-based extensions, etc. Next slide. So also on the previous slide, you saw the link to the website. You can find more information there, certainly. Gary, what did you want me to say about this? I mean,
I was just illustrating some of the scope.
All right, okay. So again, since it started out in like life sciences, its initial concern were things like biomes and habitats, etc., trying to separate out the semantics of those things. Indeed, there are different axes of differentiation for those. And we've been trying to be a bit more precise, because the usage of those terms in the life sciences, particularly microbial life sciences, is very undisciplined. And that's where we also run into an issue where we are not an authority of these terms. We're trying to capture knowledge about these terms. But at the same time, when there's sort of unrestricted usage and very loose usage, the field is sort of semantically contaminated, if you will. So we also have to play the diplomatic position of trying to be a little bit more rigorous and disciplined, while simultaneously trying to balance like the expertise that we're dealing with. Gradually, this comes to pass, especially when they become more data intensive fields and they realize, oh, we actually have a problem, because when we try to combine data about biome X, different groups mean very different things. Of course, I'm sure everyone on this call has been through this. But when they make that realization, then we engage them more productively. And we try to figure out things that are minimal definitions that we can subclass out later to satisfy the more bespoke usages of terms in the field. Next slide.
Right, that's exactly what I wanted to hear.
Okay. So yeah, we've been trying to figure out, again, how do we grow this, engaging the expert communities and also the experts in semantic engineering, and keeping the expressivity high, but also trying to match what experts are thinking, like their knowledge. Indeed, we're representing their knowledge while not diverging too much from the metaphysics of the situation. And trying to follow the OBO best practices for writing definitions, an A is a B which C's as much as possible, although that gets kind of hairy pretty quickly. But this new tool that's up here, and that's what's very exciting, this semantic harmonization activity has been really, really productive. Initially, Suite was sort of not really developing for quite a while, but now has been reinvigorated through ESIP. And initially we're kind of concerned because, of course, these are in the same domain and we don't want to compete, we'd rather collaborate. But then we developed a wonderful collaboration with ESIP and the Suite community, where we then found an expert group to extend ENVO's Cryosphere section, while simultaneously mapping that in an authoritative way to Suite content, which is typically not defined at all. And that way we're boosting the legacy usage of Suite with the semantics in ENVO, and Suite is at the expressivity more of a thesaurus-ish, a little bit more structured than that. And so ENVO allows people, this mapping allows people to shift a gear and go up or down the machine level expressivity. And then by doing this sort of cryo hackathon series with Ruth and Gary and others and Kai, we are very progressively going through the content in Suite and trying to look at the multiple, I think 23 glossaries that Ruth surveyed in the Global Cryosphere Watch in her work commissioned by the WMO of the United Nations, and trying to synthesize those definitions into their minimal form, subclassing where necessary, and creating supporting classes also where necessary. Tricky stuff, long conversations, but again, we're trying to make sure that we get something that the experts would recognize, but is of sufficient, and I say that in a sort of tentative way, sufficient semantic quality. This helps us, again, using the terminology that people actively use in literature is very important to us too, because it lets us work with text miners, natural language processors, others, to use ML approaches to then evaluate what's out there, how the ontology needs to extend, and also support automatic tagging routines that are aware of the different usages of the terms in different communities, such that some of the metadata on the classes would allow you to say, okay, give me the labels that USGS would use. Maybe they're different labels from the Europeans or the Australians for soil, or the UN for soil, but they point to the same IRI and they have roughly the same semantics. So we're trying to move in this direction. Easier said than done, and it's a slow process, but that's the intent. Let's go ahead.
You probably covered this in a way.
I think so. But what can be said there is, again, like we moved away from just the simple notion of habitat, and we refined that out to be more systematic, like habitats being defined by the organisms and populations. So the population has to have a growth rate of greater than 0. So for example, when I say zebra habitat, in your mind, you're thinking most likely of a savanna system. And that's correct. And so we worked with the Encyclopedia of Life to auto-generate class content on that based on text mining of their content. And then that allows us to move away from this sort of habitat biome discussion that took some years of my life away, and move on to broader concerns, such as the anthropogenic biomes of the world, and also entities relevant for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. We work with UN Environment on another ontology called the Sustainable Development Goal Interface Ontology, which imports large chunks of ENVO, since it is UN Environment, and linking environmental processes to sustainable development processes. And that was an eye-opener, because the language and policy is heavily negotiated and highly controlled, but in a different way. So we have to be quite careful about, let's say, over-formalizing to lose the kind of functional ambiguity that's in a lot of policy speak. Really tricky place to ontologize. But again, we have to bridge through that. Let's move on. Right, I think we talked about this, right? Yeah. Well, and the important part of that slide is this attribution. Again, with the cryo hackathons and things, we're engaging a group of experts in various fields. Some of them are cryosphere experts, some ontology engineering experts, etc., linguists, others. And so the last point, it's really important to be able to link the attribution to who contributed to it. So we have a way to trace back where this knowledge came from and why it is the way it is. All right, okay, next slide. As an example, what you see in this slide, the next slide, 17.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted you to present about ENVO is that it's so well documented compared to some other efforts.
Yeah, and Kai's been doing an immense amount of work to improve that. It surprises me to hear somebody thinks of it as well documented. I know that I've been lax in that, but Kai's been working quite hard. And also, as other new editors come on, I've always asked them to, hey, while you're learning, would you mind documenting what you're doing and what the problems are on our wiki? And that's been steadily growing things a little bit. There's more work to do there too. So here's an example of some of the Cryosphere stuff. So this is just a view diagram of part of the graph in ENVO, where we have permafrost. And of course, with the consultation of the definitions, we know that it doesn't necessarily have to include ice at all. It could just be cold rock underneath that. So we try to, we harmonize those definitions into a fairly minimal definition at the center, and adding comments for clarifications. And as you see in the little inclusion on the left, you have the dbxrefs to suite so that you can do a crosswalk between the two. And then you have some logic around what could be part of permafrost using the relation ontology from the Obo Foundry. Relation ontology relations, the ISA has quality composed primarily of, so they're controlled and interoperable with other ontologies in that space at least. Okay, let's move on.
Okay, I have one little point I added to your diagram on the right, lower right, the prototype description, which is the idea that you have the formal descriptions with axioms, but there's lots more we know about that. And sometimes the prototype idea, what's typical, is interesting. And that's included in the comment down below.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So like there's certainly always, this could be its own hierarchy, right? This could be its own ontology, frankly. And, you know, ENVO has actually come to incubate a number of branches where, you know, if somebody comes to us and says, hey, we'd like to develop a compatible, and that's important, interoperable ontology for permafrost, we, you know, add them on as co-editors or spin up a new ontology that, and then ENVO would import that in a more modular way. So that's happened a few times with agronomy and food ontologies, etc. Yeah, so very much so. Cool. Same sort of thing. Things with like nevation and different kinds of snow, like fern or neve, and how one becomes the other through processes. So again, ENVO has a branch of processes too, which allow us to use the relations ontology process algebra and process relations to link entities and define them also through their relation to environmental processes. So, you know, this is the result of X entering process Y, that becomes Z, that has output Z. So it allows us some greater chance to axiomatize some of the textual definitions a little bit further than we did before we started adding processes. Back in the day, we didn't have processes. As soon as we added them, we had a lot more fun. Okay.
The one point I'd make about this is that you can see these controlled vocabulary terms from the cryosphere, like innovation and nev and firm. They're now within a sort of shared conceptual space. They're related. So it's well beyond a single definition now that you can see here as more of a interesting pattern.
Yeah, sure. And indeed, you know, machine agents will look at this, obviously. It'll look at the linkage structure and, you know, the applications for NLP, for example, even if you don't see one of those particular words, but you see similar words that pertain to the processes that generate an entity, you can infer, you can change your Bayesian matrix, etc., according to your needs. Yeah.
The other point I would make about this is that it leverages other parts of OBO, and it leverages Pato here, so that when you're putting this together, there are these other ontologies with relationships and so forth and ideas that you can leverage.
Exactly. I mean, that's one of the principles in the OBO Foundry, this orthogonality, that we're not, there is an ontology of qualities, Pato, and we, rather than making our own, if at all possible, we import it or ask them to create terminology or content classes that we import to expand ours and cross-axiomatize. That helps things not get too redundant and boost interoperability too. Sometimes this is not always possible, again, if it's like a very different model, but it usually is. Yeah, I think I've said most of all of this, and just the last part, yeah, there's certainly more to do all the time to invite collaboration. And also with groups like this who think about definitions very carefully, we'd like to learn. Chris Mungle has worked with us frequently, and he always is putting pressure on me to get a little bit more systematic with definitions. And I recognize we do, but I also recognize we have to balance some of that with the ambiguity and conventions in the fields of our users. So I'm trying to find a good balance between the two. It's a shifting space.
The next slide is for Kai. So maybe he could jump in here and say a few minutes about this, and then maybe we'll get to some of the chat and questions. But there are more slides, but I think they don't need to be covered. Pier's covered a number of those things. So we'll be able to move on to a discussion, I think, following Kai's presentation. Okay?
All right. Yeah, I want to leave lots of time for discussion, so I don't
Yes.
want to ramble on too long. So hi, I'm Kai. Thank you for having me here, Gary, and everyone for inviting me. So yeah, I just want to explain very briefly, building on what the other two said, that interoperability is really important, as we all would know and probably agree, et cetera, et cetera. And the way that we do this within OBO is we try to have common patterns, ideas, tools that we then try to reuse over and over and over when possible. And OBO is a very, the Open Biological and Biomedical Ontology Foundry and Library, it's a very fairly well-developed resource or set of resources. Hundreds of different people from all over the world working on it together. It can be challenging, it can be fun. Anyway, it's, I'm sure, you know, I'm sure there are thoughts about what it is, but at a very pragmatic level, I want to point out that the OBO technology stack is very well developed. So right now, I'm just going to mention the robot module here, but there's also modules for creating ontologies that follow these same structures. So specifically, so I could talk about that if needed, but for now, I'll focus on robot. And robot is the OBO command line tool, which is able to do a lot of complicated things that the Java API, or sorry, that the OWL API would do, but using, you know, more sophisticated Java code, but run through the command line. So it makes it possible for, you know, people like me, technologists, to be able to actually implement these things. So one of the features of robot, there are many, it can do many, many things, but one of them specifically is called the template module and the template tool from robot. And the robot template, what's great about it is it's able to convert data that's in a templatable format, like a CSV or TSV or some sort of modular format like that, and convert that into OWL code using whatever annotation properties, object properties, data properties that you want to specify in it. So you can boot up a whole new ontology from scratch, just using one CSV file or TSV file that's formatted like a robot template in a couple lines of the command line, and you're good to go. Using that within the larger OBO tooling ecosystem allows us to actually import all these different modules. So before the example of ENVO and Pato was brought up, Within a new ontology, one could import ENVO, Pato, and Kevi, for example, or we have that already in ENVO, but you could use all three and use them together and import the terms from all three. And that's, in my mind, really what interoperability is about, when you link to a new knowledge space and you can actually get at new connections to terms because they're defined and they link to each other and it's understandable to a machine who might be searching through it. Anyway, that's just my take. I'm sure there's other thoughts on it, but I specifically want to talk about here is this ENVO robot template and merge workflow. And so basically what it's done is it's doing its best to guide users through the process of contributing new terms to ENVO. Of course, this could be repurposed by anyone to do any ontology. So please feel free to use and steal this code and tell me if the documentation is insufficient in any way. I would love to get more feedback about it. So the basic idea is that you can follow this documentation, hopefully, and get new terms into ENVO, or at least try to prepare them as best as possible in terms of both steps for non-ontologists, collaborators who are just data managers who want to get a few terms in, ontologists who really know the details, and more tooling people who like to play around on the command line and actually convert CSV files into OWL and merge it into the bigger file. So yeah, if you could, Gary, if you could just briefly click on the link to the robot template and merge workflow. Not that one, the one on top. Actually, I'll just, anyway, so I don't want to take too much time here. I could briefly explain or show some of the workflow, but at the very highest level, there's a lot of things that can be done with it. So Gary, would you like more from me, or would you like me to actually go into and explain some of this in further detail?
I think that might do for now. Sorry about clicking on the wrong one. It's not exactly coming up here for some reason.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
I think it might be useful to turn it over to some discussion. We may be able to show. You can probably in the chat, not on the Zoom chat, but on our Summit chat, you can probably put a link into where they can go for this, and also note where there's information about how to use the template on your GitHub source, right?
Yeah, sorry, was that to me? Yes, there's information
Yes.
about how to use the template. Specifically, this tool, this example presented here is for using it for ENVO for a specific purpose. But like I said, it could be used to build any ontology for any purpose.
Great. Okay, so with that, I guess one of the things to do is ask about questions. So I need to go over to the chat that I wasn't on and see if there is things there.
So I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Someone asked
the chat on Zoom has some itself, right?
So just real quick, responding to this one,
Yeah,
OBO
that would be good.
there is a format called OBO. It's not completely deprecated. It's not preferred. We prefer OWL now, obviously the higher expressivity, but this robot command line tool can handle both and convert between the two. But OWL, of course, has more expressive semantics. And at this point, almost all OBO ontologies are using OWL rather than OBO, or at least if they're using OBO, it's being exported to OWL in the end.
Right. So I see that Leah has her hand up in the Summit chat. So maybe Leah, maybe you could unmute, and if you are muted, and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. And thank you for the presenters. I really enjoyed hearing you chat about your work. One technical question and then one more, I guess, more asking for more comment. One technical question. I know you talked about the OBO robot. I was wondering if the template for submitting terms was like for like OBO terms or like it's adaptable to anything. And I guess this is to Pier and maybe Kai as well. If you could speak more to the idea of, balancing rigor and fidelity to a specific approach and structure to your terminology with the needs and wants of your large base of users and definitions. I think this is something that we're going to face in our project. We haven't really opened up our ontology to everybody yet, but I'm anticipating this might be an issue, and I'm just wondering what strategies you've used to kind of talk users down, I guess, cases where their changes might be a little bit beyond what makes sense for scope. I'll mute now. Thank you so much.
Great. Any other comments on that?
Pierre, you maybe want to respond to that. Thank you for the question, Lei. That's a great question.
There are several questions in there. Is there anyone specifically you'd like to address to me, Leah?
So I think the latter one is definitely for you, Pierre, just how you navigate the issue of rigor versus users, wants, and definitions.
Right.
And I think that's the discussion question, but there was just like a quick technical question about whether the template for submitting terms was really sculpted for OBO, or if it's like for any, or if it's adaptable to RDF or OWL.
So on that latter point, the balancing part, it's, it's a bunch of ways of saying getting the right people in the conversation. So it's not just one group of experts. It'll be some from different regions, from different disciplinary communities dealing with the same things in the world, so that they see the problem that we face as ontology engineers, like these different views on things and epistemology interfacing with metaphysics and all of that, right? And when they start that conversation, you kind of facilitate it along and say, okay, look, I'm listening to you and I see that this is the common ground. And then you put a minimal definition. And then you go back and forth on that until everybody's equally unhappy. And then you know you've done the right thing. I mean, there are many things, there are many techniques to use, but that's more or less it in a nutshell.
And then to your latter point, sorry, Pierre, can I jump in?
Yeah,
and then to the more technical side. So if I wasn't super clear earlier. So this tool that I'm presenting, or that I've given the link to, is more general purpose, but what it can do is it can take any data that's in tabular format and turn it into a more expressive format. Usually it's OWL, but it could be Turtle as well. It could be RDF. It could be any of those types of formats. So it's just like a very convenient way of building out ontologies relative to Protégé, in my opinion. It also kind of allows you to work from a spreadsheet, which most domain scientists or experts or data curators are kind of more used to. And it's kind of like it allows for a cleaner battleground to discuss what the definition should be, et cetera.
Thank you so much. This is huge. Thank you.
Okay, well, Robbie has his hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. What I have done, just a little explanation. I copied the Zoom chat to SOAP Hub chat so that people can look at the questions from people in either chat. I have some questions which I have also put in the chat. And they start, I hope I get a couple of minutes to ask them. We have understood a lot of emphasis is that you harmonize vocabulary, you are on the way to success towards ontology harmonization. But in the increasing complexity of semantic meaning, or in the richer semantic meaning, what Gary showed was a rising straight line, and ontology harmonization is at the top, while vocabulary harmonization is at the bottom. So what happened to the intermediate complexity is the question number one. Question number two is, if we have unambiguous telescoping ontologies, for example, you could start with marine ecosystem, then marine biology, then phytoplankton and physical oceanography. In this kind of telescoping chain, how would you harmonize deeper dives into the domains or connected domains to be harmonized ontology? I have a few more questions, but I will stop at these two.
Let's start with that one.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one, so that's semantic gradient or semantic ladder, depends on how you approach it. The harmonization activity could happen at any point. And even when we're doing ontological harmonization, you also do elements of the others, certainly. It's very dynamic. It's not that sometimes we don't get past just getting the terms aligned roughly with glossary style definitions. That's already a step in the right direction at least, and then we can visit that again to refine it and to move it up until we get it to machine readability. I think that's the theme that we have, just trying to get them increasingly more machine readable and actionable. So they're certainly not excluded. They're kind of subsumed, I would say. And sometimes, we don't end up doing an ontological harmonization. We end up doing more thesaurus grade, rough, broader than, narrower than sort of stories. And on the second point, with telescoping ontologies, like working in the environment stuff, I don't know if there is such a thing. It's often like we have an idea of a domain that humans like to talk about. They've sort of partitioned reality in their minds in this way. But as soon as you get into it and start, especially looking at the processes, what's physical comes from what's biological. Diatoms built the White Cliffs of Dover. Organic carbon has multiple meanings. Some of them have to do with life, some of them not, etc. So there's a linguistic ambiguity, there's a conceptual ambiguity, and it all sort of connects eventually. So the trick, I think, is there to work with those communities in their comfort zone, and then identify the people who are the multidisciplinary cross-boundary people, and then with them propose links between those silos. If they have, again, it's a very human thing at the end. If the people proposing those links have sufficient standing in the communities, you're likely to get somewhere, as opposed to trying to come up with a clean formalization because, well, nature typically is not that clean. Kai, do you have?
No, let's take some more questions, maybe.
I have a comment to make on the answers. The areas where I see successful implementation more and more, and I don't know how much it is machine generated, is into things like NLM, the clinical side of ontologies, the genome side of ontologies, omics type. I do see a lot of progress there, but I don't know how much is automated in the upper inclined machine language sense.
Well, so for example, the gene ontology is part of the Obo Foundry, and they try to automate some parts of it, but a lot of it still is human curated. But there are certain patterns that they follow, which allows for the machine expressivity. And
a lot of these listings of ontologies under Obo and so on are nothing but a traverse to Sumo or upper ontology, TLO, the top level ontology, and then back down to the other domain. But we want more horizontal integration among ontologies for them to interoperate well with each other.
So like when an import is done on a branch of another ontology, a domain ontology like Pato or Kevi or anything that has content, yeah, we pull in the tree up to the, in this case, buffo or upper level formalization. But when we axiomatize, we are cross-axiomatizing at the mid and low level. I don't really care if it's a generically dependent continuant that's part of an ice mass. I want to know that we're talking about a brine channel. So we pull in that, and that's brine, and that's water that goes to Kebi, out of ENVO to Kebi. So those links are happening. It is a kind of fleshed out graph as much as we can. Again, there are parts of ENVO that don't have them at all and need a lot of attention. It's a fairly large ontology. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Ravi, is that it?
No, I have a couple more. Should I
Okay.
go ahead?
well,
You go ahead with one more, and then we'll turn to Todd.
Yeah, I was
You
gonna
guys
say
want-
maybe we should let some other
Yes,
people have a chance.
Yes.
Yes, I will wait for 5 minutes because we have another half an hour. So please go ahead.
You want Todd to go ahead?
Yes.
Okay, Todd.
Howdy, gang. I'm sorry I got here late to the party, but I was just actually looking at the ENVO release from 2016. Is that the latest? Hello?
No, that shouldn't be. That was a pause of shock. Hold on a second.
I-
Our last release is not. It's 2020. It's in June 2020. I'll drop the link in the. You want me to use the SOAP thing, right?
SOAP Hub, yeah.
Okay.
There-
I'm at your GitHub site. I went to the releases directory.
There's a so on GitHub it's the tags directory.
Oh, that's perfectly not clear. Okay, well, based on what I was looking at from 2016, you're basing your work on BFO. But my question is, you're aware of Barry's efforts with the ISO and the new version of BFO, that is BFO 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and the temporalized relations.
Mm-hmm.
Are you using those or plan to use those?
We're not sure, frankly. We can get a lot about the temporal content of things through the succession and transformation of stuff through processes.
Right.
We still have to evaluate whether it's necessary to use those. And also in Obo Foundry, there's the move towards the Cobb ontology, which is a sort of lightweight upper level, which is be much easier for non-ontologists to read, but has in the background maps to Buffo, Buffo2, and perhaps the ISO version. But right now, we've been sort of busy doing the mid and lower level engineering for the actual content of the domains, the things that people will actually be querying on. So we've been less focused on, let's say, upper level wranglings at this stage.
But
Okay.
even if Obo does move to Cobb, it'll still be aligned with Buffalo.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ultimately, it shouldn't matter. So we've had people talking about, okay, how do we align it to Dolce or whatever other upper level? And, it should, in theory, be possible. Like, we try to gather up the ENVO content into a few top level classes that could then probably be aligned reasonably well, maybe not fantastically, but reasonably well with other upper levels.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, let me just ask, because Celia is online here and we'll be presenting in a couple of weeks, but I wanted to, if she has some comments or questions, I wanted to give her an opportunity to have them now before Pier and Kai have to go.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the presentations. It was very interesting, and I'm impressed to see what you've been able to work to obtain, like, definitions that seem to be very good and useful, and that you've been able to balance the textual definitions for humans with the axiomatic parts and not making all visually. Well, I was browsing the ENVO website, OLS, where you can drag the graph and everything, and I find it really great. So yeah, do you use, I was wondering, do you use some sort of templating system for the definition contents, either for the axioms or for the textual definitions, or both?
Well, so what I was trying to present earlier was the workflow for that purpose. So it's like a merge. I didn't get a chance to go deep into it, but it is a templating system to populate all of the relevant annotation properties, definitions, axioms, et cetera, in the ontology. We can also use Protege. That's the standard way. They can be used together. And we're working on and expanding that documentation to make it more clear how to structure definitions properly. But yeah, in short, yes.
But so what I understand from the template you had, it's more like, let's say, terms and definitions, comments, URIs. But I was specifically wondering if you had like finer grained templates for the actual contents of the definition themselves. Like, let's say, okay, this basically it's kind of like the axioms. I guess the axioms would be kind of the templates, but you could like reuse them at lower levels. So if you have a subclasses, you know already what kind of axioms would be required. I'm not sure if that makes
so
sense.
we have some other systems that are kind of follow design patterns. So there's some other tools we follow, like for something like if you wanted to make terms that followed a similar pattern, like concentrations of chemicals and materials, then we have other tools to kind of automate that process as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's in the build process. I dropped a link into the SOAP hub.
Okay.
And yeah, once you detect a branch or a hierarchy that has regular enough content, you can then sort of create a pattern that's driven by a template. And again, we're not developing this technology ourselves. we're inheriting that from the OBO technology stack. So we're also a bit more sure that other people are doing it in a similar way, again, to increase the interoperability. And we try to use the same relations from the relation ontology.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Before I turn to the next question or comment, Pierre, Kai, how long can you stay? I know you have other things to do, so I don't want to exceed your limits.
Oh yeah, I have to leave on the hour.
Okay, all
I
right,
can stick around.
all right. So Ravi, you have another question or comment or two?
Or perhaps anyone else, if there's other questions we
I
can
just
help answer.
raised his hand. Sometimes Ravi has
There was
trouble.
this
He's
question in the chat, the Zoom chat about manual alignment. Who was asking that?
Maria?
Is that
Yes, I'm asking about that.
okay?
I'm sorry.
Uh,
Yeah.
because I'm working in a project and I'm aware about some tools, but I'm not completely aware about. It's a little bit maybe far away from the topic that is discussed at now, but it's related with ontologies. Because asking about, are you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm asking about an alignment of, for example, OWA ontology. If you know some kind of tool to create a manual alignment.
Are you asking about it at an individual concept level or a term level or some broader across the ontology type of alignment?
Of a term level, yeah.
So there are several ways to do it. When we do it manually, sometimes we just add a property in Protégé that includes the IRI of the term and the other resource that we would like to map to. But of course, this can get a little bit heavy because if you have many mappings, it'll inflate your ontology. So in the SOAP chat, I'll drop in something we're exploring now with others in the OPO Foundry, this sort of matrix-based way of creating mapping. So we can store it outside of the ontology file itself, but it's a very simple format to be able to read in and then cross or walk across ontologies with some qualifications about how confident you are about that mapping, what kind of relation is used for that mapping, etc. You know, like, are you at an OWL same as level, or are you on a SCOS related concept level? You know, that sort of thing. So that triple SOM, I think, is more scalable in terms of a technology point of view. But there are many ways to do it. And the main thing is just to make sure that other people can read it, and you're not doing something too idiosyncratic. So it shouldn't diverge too much from other things.
Okay, I guess Ravi gets a second chance now.
Yeah. Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, we
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Very briefly, please look at the question in the chat if you have time. But before the speakers go away, some of them, I wanted to ask specific application of your ice glacier lake ablation process. I want to give you a very recent example of last week in the Himalayas. We had a very interesting phenomena. Nobody is able to 100% attribute it to some known cause, but definitely the earth science images show that at some place on the top of the hill, there is snow, and later it disappears or slides down. And then there is a tsunami that breaks a power plant. I mean, hydro power plant, right? Dam. So 150 lives are lost. It would be nice to apply your glacier ice ontology in that kind of situation to find out whether it was ablation or some other reason relating to soil erosion, etc. Another thing is similar application on Texas snow, which is very different than our North US snow. That would be an interesting case for glacial or ice-related phenomena. My other question is that a lot is being said, but I'm not able to connect how the metadata are connected in this exercise. And second is that NIEM is able to intercommunicate across domains meaningfully because it has a controlled vocabulary, word combinations, or so-called dictionary, you can say, in each domain. And that can be extended to other domains. So two interesting questions. What do metadata do for us in this case? And then how do you model something like NIEM? Will your integrated ontologies, harmonized ones, look like NIEM? Or how is NIEM different?
Well, let's let Kai try to answer a little bit of that. I want to thank Pier for coming on because I know he has other pressing time constraints. So
Sorry, I
thank
would
you,
stay
Pier.
I would stay if I can, but it's a UNESCO
Yes.
steering group. But very briefly to the first part. So Ravi, with sort of either ablation or some sort of mass wasting process, like an avalanche that leads to a wave. So we try to keep the ingredients to allow people to express that in ENVO using the process relation semantics. So I put a link, IRI, to the mass wasting processes that we have so far. They include things like avalanches, or we could add more if you think rock slides, etc. And then there are also the things for tsunamis. In this case, I think it's more just a wave displaced mechanically. And you can use those relations at an instance level to express what happens in a particular region. But certainly we can add that as general class axioms if it is something, I mean, it sounds like something that happens more often. So that's what we primarily try to do. It's an open world, many things can happen in nature, nature is strange. But at least we can provide the ingredients and some patterns to allow users to come up with the right things at the instance level. But thank you all, I really do have to run.
Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you for a very good addition to Gary and other speakers' talk.
Great. Ciao, ciao.
Okay, I think he handled that.
Yes, he did. He did, and he gave a good reference, although it would be nice to now start applying some of these.
Yeah, and then, in a general, the application is really an important thing. We're talking about instances. So things like ENVO give you a really starting point, but then when you have an application in mind, you're going to have some distinctions that might not have gotten there, but you can start there, build it out, sort of like taking a pattern and specifying it a bit more. And this supports interoperability, so it's not a one-time thing.
Yeah, iterated over time, I think you may be able to explain a lot of events like that.
Yeah, being able to actually go and explain events like that is fairly downstream of an ontology. I think what we're really concerned with is representing that which exists in the universe and getting it into a model to be used together, hopefully. So we're trying to support downstream applications that might be able to do something like that, but at the moment I don't see that happening just yet.
Right. The way I talk about that is that ontologies don't precede models. I mean, that's what scientists are doing. They're building models, and then we can formalize those models in a different way than they may have formalized them.
But how will we connect the two, Gary? Will we connect them through like solvers? If you are familiar with flow tools, they plug in a solver, which then carries out a mathematical analytical computation and comes out with a result, while the flow dynamics tool works on the top of it.
Well, an ontology is useful for saying this data is annotated with this term, and then whoever wants to use it downstream for whatever application can use it. So let's say that flow solver example, it needed turbidity data and like atmosphere, I don't know, whatever it is. There's two parameters. If two different people all over the world use the same IRI, the same term to feed into that same model, then we all know that they were talking about the same thing. Then if your application says like, okay, I want data from IRI A and B, and I see anyone in the world has given me that, then I can automatically or find better ways to get that data to them and actually put it into whatever that model or downstream application is. We're doing the front end of that, which is just to kind of standardize people on what they're actually talking about and have a place that's consistent for it to be on the web.
Very good explanation. Instantiation will happen when those downstream applications become productive.
Right. So I mean, the first step is to get people putting their data, into things that are clean and readable, and ideally have some sort of vocabulary. It doesn't have to be an ontology, but ideally some sort of vocabulary that might have certain characteristics, like an identifier that can be found on the web, or at least some sort of controlled name and definition so that it could be linked to other systems, etc.
So now back to my old question, metadata fall in which category?
It's a little complicated. I want to give other people a chance if there's other questions. Sorry, not to.
No, that was my last question.
I will just say very quickly, I mean, so there's lots of metadata around. We're trying to formalize it. So if you think in terms of that spectrum of hierarchy that I showed on one of the early slides, there's metadata sort of documenting things at any level exists. And we're importing it. We're importing lots of that into a tool like Protege.
I mean, the metadata is a complicated term. It could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But at the very simplest level, let's say if you're someone, an oceanographer, collects data about the turbidity of the seawater or the density of the seawater, then terms from ENVO that describe those things could be seen as metadata or data, depending on who's looking at it.
But one of your slide is totally devoted to committees like Dublin Core and metadata and so on.
Well, so there's many, like I said, there's many other systems for providing vocabularies or metadata that can be used for data annotation or concept representation, and that's the whole point of harmonization, is to try and work together. So for Dublin Core, for example, there isn't necessarily something that's aligning it to OBO, but maybe in the future that would be something you can look into.
Good.
Yeah, you can think very simply of an IRI as some metadata. Useful thing about a piece of data or term that people want to have for documentation purposes. Let's turn to Todd. He has a hand up.
Howdy. Hey, Kai. Hopefully I'll ask some questions that won't be too obnoxious. I did hear earlier in the presentation about the your focus on definitions and harmonizing them, and the diversity with which you have to encounter, or the diversity that you do encounter. But when I did download the 10 June 2020 ontologies, and I'm looking at that through some of the classes, and I noticed they don't have any natural language definitions, but there are some other...
Natural language definitions? What do you mean? Like the RDFS definitions? Or sorry, the IAO 115 definitions? Those are natural language definitions?
No, a natural language definition, so that someone coming into this ontology can look at this label, say food product type, and get an understanding of what the creators of this ontology had in mind. So in particular, you are using, what are you using?
So IAO 115 is definition, and that's the definition annotation property that's used throughout the OBO Foundry. So there are classes that don't have one, for sure, and there's a lot of work to be done, but the majority of classes do have an IAO 115 definition, which is a human readable definition that's been haggled out, described, fought over, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay,
so those do exist.
The reason I mentioned natural language definition is because that's how you're actually using this. That is to be contrasted with the formal definitions. So there's two questions I have there. One, I thought I also heard Pier talking about the issue of provenance. So where I don't see an annotation, actually I was looking at the annotation properties, I don't see a specific annotation property to indicate the source of a definition or sources of a definition if you had to merge some. And then are you worried or concerned about providing a natural language definition that is easily translatable into a formalized definition, either in OWL or common logic or first order logic?
Yeah, absolutely. No, those are good questions. I mean, it's a lot of work to do all this, and we do our best to do it
as
we can. So like I said, the majority of classes do have a definition, which is natural language. I think maybe you might have clicked on one that didn't. Like there are plenty that don't have it, but the majority do. And
Sure.
we're trying to fix it. And when we notice one that doesn't have it, we try to add it and fix that. In terms of formalization, yes, we are working on that as well. It depends. It's a little touch and go depending on who's editing. Usually it's been Pierre running a lot of this. So it depends, like sometimes it will have those formalizations as in axioms to other things, links primarily composed of, formed as a result of, et cetera, et cetera. We're working toward having more consistent design patterns such that we could have, like a process hierarchy kind of following some sort of consistent design pattern, which would allow us to kind of help to auto-populate those formalisms based on the entities in question. We don't have a ton of examples of that yet, but that is a direction we're working toward.
I also noticed some of the annotation or most of the annotation properties don't have natural language definitions.
So
that only,
so the annotation, so the definitions do have annotation properties on them, but sorry, you were saying, sorry, I don't.
The annotations, look at the annotation properties. So for instance, you have one that that's labeled has broad synonym. And okay, what the heck does that mean? That is so that there's no definition for the annotation property itself.
Well, so that has,
I mean, you can be recursive here.
Has broad synonym is a convention adopted from SCOS that's been brought into the information artifact ontology, which is the ontology of annotation properties that we use. And those do have definitions on. Actually, I don't know if all of them do, but that is the current state as it is in OBO. And if you have any suggestions about fixing that, we'd love to hear it.
I send those things to Barry all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I thought I had one more last question. I'm impressed that you're taking on this area. It's so challenging to say the least.
You should be seeing a screen, right? This is part of the robot template.
Well, one last question, Gary, if I may. This is probably an easy one to answer. I'm looking at the envo.owl file from 10 June 2020, and you have a huge list of a whole bunch of classes that have been made obsolete. Why do you carry those along?
To make sure that the provenance is still there once, not all of them, like they should all have a term replaced by, not all of them do, and that's, mistakes on our part. But for the most part, we do keep those around to say, here's a term that used to exist here, for example, something that's now in Foodon, and here's a link to where it is now, so that if your database was using that term, you're not going to like just drop out of, you can go and recreate it and you go figure out, okay, it's now Foodon 12 instead of ENVO 25.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, that brings up another question, unfortunately. Sorry, Gary. Do you have a list of requirements that you're trying to meet with this work?
Well, so that's the thing, is it can be a bit open-ended because we are trying to represent environments to a variety of different groups, stakeholders, et cetera. So there's a lot of different people, a lot of different systems using it for very different purposes, which can make the development very difficult. Also, it's an open source project that doesn't have any dedicated funding. So it's kind of done as much as we can, and we're trying to bring on new people all the time.
So that's part of the context and audience that I mentioned. The work within a particular context for a particular audience. They bring their requirements. I'm showing part of this template because I wanted to respond to this idea that we may not be handling provenance well. And certainly within this part of the effort that we're doing in terms of this harmonization, you can see all kinds of provenance. So for example, we have ORCID IDs, we have cross-referencing that Pier also showed you, comment cross-reference, where to get things. So if you look at the population of the template that provides the input into the OWL, eventually, it is quite well documented, including synonyms and so forth. So hopefully that shows you the quality of the work. Todd, you're done, right? Any other questions?
Maria asked another question.
Oh, okay. I didn't see her hand up.
Posted it. No, she's not on this chat. She did on the other one. So I just copied it on the chat. Maria, Gary, she can speak now if she can. You can unmute her.
That's actually probably Ken.
Can?
Okay. I will join to this group. Thank you. Actually, I think I'm a part of this group.
Sorry, was there a question, Maria,
Just
that we
my
could answer?
internet
Or
is not very good quality. It's
So what I see posted here in the chat now is more on the alignment. Is that right?
yes, yeah.
You could use a robot template to automate the process.
that
but it
was
would need-
my response.
That's
Yeah,
your
that was my
response. Okay.
Alex
Okay.
says, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's been answered. And you can look in the chat for that answer.
Are there any other questions?
Inside of the chat. Okay.
So Maria, really
Yes.
briefly, just to your question, I answered in the chat, I'll just say it again. So you could use a robot template to kind of help facilitate the process of mapping, is in like, having a clean template to put things together, which gets compiled into OWL to, map your ontology to another one or whatever. But in terms of tools to actually map ontologies, that's a little tricky. There's a project called SSSOM, I believe, which Chris Mungle out of Lawrence Berkeley developed.
Write this
Yeah,
project.
I will put a link in the chat to that. Yes, I'm not super familiar with it, so I can't really answer questions about it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Pier mentioned that already. He has a link, a GitHub link on it. We can post that again.
Okay.
If you're looking at are you looking at the SoapHub chat? You can also post it into the Zoom chat.
I think I use only the Zoom chat. The other
Okay, I'm posting it into the Zoom chat now. This is what Pier provided a link. Okay.
Yes, go ahead and check out that resource. I can't really speak to it. I haven't used it personally. But that would be one OBO Foundry style solution for mapping.
Okay.
Okay, I don't see any more hands up. I'm not sure there's anything else in the chat. So maybe what we want to do is introduce the topic for next session next week. Is there somebody here who can tell us about that? I know Ken can.
Yes. We are talking. Yes, but that's it's about TSV format. That's the triplet format, and the OWO format. That's the other format. Okay. And they have for OWO format here. In this project, they have IOC about the OWO format. They don't have. They also don't have this OBO format. It seems that actually not all the just a few projects use OBO format for working.
So if I could just briefly, so OBO is an older format that was used within the OBO Foundry. It's no longer used very widely. There are a few projects that still use it a little bit, but everything does get exported to OWL. So it's typically OWL that's used, but it is a format that still lingers and is used in some cases.
Yes. Thank you.
So Ken, do you have anything to say about the next session? Because we're running.
Well, Alex, could you say something? Alex,
I meant next week.
It's not next.
Yeah,
I wanted Alex to talk about the next session in your track.
Sure, that's good too. We can do
I'm
both.
not ready yet.
So could you give us a little comment about it, Alex?
My comment is known. We have 3 speakers about advantages of formal definitions, but details I don't know yet.
Okay. So the topic would be definitions. That is the track.
Formal definitions. The
Yes,
advantage of formal definitions, I know it would be great, but I don't know details.
Okay. All right. So then next week, we're moving to track C. So this is going to be neurosymbolic learning ontologies. So we're going to have 2 speakers, Artur Garced and Pascal Hitzler. So this is going to be another panel discussion. Ram, do you have anything you can add about this session next week? Are you still here?
Looks like he's dropped off, Ken.
Oh, he seems to, no, he's still here. I'll ask him to unmute.
Oh, there he is, yes.
I guess he might be away from his desk for the moment. But that's, so next week we're going to start session, track C with, and we'll begin the topic of neurosymbolic learning ontologies. And hopefully we can link that with what you're doing in ENVO. I imagine you'll be interested in some of these technologies for the development work that you're doing at ENVO. And with that,
Ken, that's a very good comment, Ken. That
Yeah.
means bringing synergy from our different tracks to each other.
yes.
And that's a wonderful, wonderful input. I think we need to note it down somewhere.
I'm looking forward to that from that point of view, but I see that Terry has raised his hand. So maybe, do we have time to squeeze this comment or question in?
This is a
Yes,
made a comment. It's not talking about today's session. I sent a letter to Ken asking for how to get to the recording from last week, and it's locked. You know, the answer, he gave me an answer, but I couldn't get to it because the recording was locked.
Oh, thanks for, yeah, thanks
Yeah,
for
that's
telling
worth
me that.
knowing.
I'll see about fixing that. I'm sorry about that. If you ever have any problem like that, please send me an email.
Okay, well, I just discovered it yesterday and thought,
Okay, great. Appreciate that. Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to get the permissions right.
I have a very short comment about what Michael Gruninger put in the chat. He says that there is some, without going on top level, the interaction among ontologies has some advantages, and you can read what he put in the chat. Somebody knocking.
Someone is not in, that's me here.
Oh, Ram,
Sorry,
you made it.
Ram here. Next week we have actually a little bit change in terms of the speaker, so I'll send out an email. Or it seems Arthur Garces is not able to come. Let me put my video on. Okay. He's not able to come because he's moving that day, I believe, and he didn't realize that. Okay. And so I have another speaker who's going to do who's going to be doing it in place of, let me just look at it. Pascal Hitzler. Okay. Louis Lam will be talking about Louis Lam from Brazil, sorry, will be the speaker. So I will send out I'll get the titles and the abstracts and it'll send it out in the next couple of days. Again, my apologies that Arthur couldn't make it. It's a last minute. He sent me an email 4 days ago.
Okay, great. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Hope everyone will be able to make it to next week's meeting.
It's going to be a great session, I can tell you that much,
Yeah.
with the neurosymbolic computing. And both these guys are doing some good work.
Great. So give me the latest information and I'll try getting some more advertising out.
Yeah, I'll try to get the information out today or tomorrow, Ken.
Okay, great. And with that, we're going to adjourn today.
Okay, thanks, Kai.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you,
inviting me,
Kai.
Gary.
goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you very much.